Forget not the tyranny of this wall, nor the love of freedom that made it fall. This is a quote from graffiti on the Berlin Wall. For 28 years, from August 13, 1961 to November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall stood between East and West Berlin and virtually epitomized the Cold War. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the Berlin Wall, the circumstances that led to its construction, the impact it had across the globe, and what ultimately led to its collapse. The Potsdam Conference of July to August of 1945 officially divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Post-World War II, these zones were to be administered by the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. But there was one interesting twist. The capital, Berlin, which was deep inside the Soviet zone, was supposed to be divided into 4 sectors as well, which meant deep inside the Soviet zone would be a city section administered by the Western Allies. The Soviets were not very happy with this arrangement and tried their best to kick out the Western Allies from Berlin. And how did they try to achieve this? The Berlin Blockade of 1948. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets blocked all rail, road, and water access to the western side of Berlin. The aim was to starve the city's 2.5 million residents until the Western Allies abandoned Berlin or halted their plans for a West German state. But instead of retreating, the United States and its allies came up with one of the most creative and inventive solutions in history to aggression. I'm talking about the Berlin Airlift, which lasted more than a year and delivered more than 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and other goods to West Berlin by air. Exhausted, the Soviets called off the blockade in 1949. Now, the Berlin Airlift was key because it suddenly established the superiority of the United States across the globe. The rest of the world acknowledged this new leader post-World War II who had the ability to fight aggression with creativity. The Berlin blockade was defeated without a single bullet being fired. And then, for about a decade, there was relative calm in the region. Berliners on both sides of the city could move around fairly freely. Typically, East Berliners would try to seek work in the West, and West Berliners would try to indulge in some inexpensive pursuits like haircuts, etc., on the eastern side. Trains and subway lines carried passengers back and forth across the city. There was one issue, though, which really irked the Soviets, especially Stalin. The Soviets had faced massive casualties during World War II, and Stalin squarely blamed the Germans for that. So he did not want Germany prospering post-World War II. He did not want to create any scenario which would allow Germany to attack the Soviets again. The Americans, though, realized that impoverishing the Germans would not be sustainable in the long run. So West Germany needed to be a self-sustaining, vibrant economy. And to achieve that, it was important to help Germans move past Nazi ideology, combat anti-American sentiment, and foster democratic values through books, music, films, and cultural exchange. So how was this achieved? The short answer: America housed libraries, which sprung up across West Germany, including West Berlin. Starting 1946, these libraries provided free access to literature, Western ideals, and cultural materials to reintroduce Western democracy to the Germans. But most importantly, they served as meeting points for politicians, business people, and citizens to discuss, learn, and engage with the Western world. And they turned out to be immensely popular. From 6,000 visitors in 1946, these libraries had nearly 2 million visitors by 1954. The Americans even operated a book mobile program to reach those who didn't live in major cities. In all of this, there was one big issue. The East Germans were using East Berlin as a loophole to get to West Germany. So if you were an East German and wanted to escape the communist repression in East Germany, all you had to do was get to East Berlin and then use a subway train or simply walk over into West Berlin to emigrate to West Germany. By 1961, approximately 3.5 million East Germans, which was roughly 20% of the population, had defected to West Germany. And this led to tensions flaring up in the region once again in 1958. The Soviets had just gone ahead in the space race with the launch of Sputnik, so they wanted to have a debate with the West on equal terms. The mass exodus into West Germany was leading to a severe deficit in technical manpower in East Germany. And all of this ultimately led to a June 1961 very contentious Vienna summit between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Like Stalin, Khrushchev threatened to cut off Allied access to West Berlin to stop this massive brain drain from East to West Germany. And it is said that at the summit, Kennedy indirectly hinted that he was not opposed to the erection of a wall between East and West Berlin as a much better alternative to a war. As news of this failed summit spread, there was a massive panic across East Germany. Fearing that the East Germans may erect a barrier between East and West Berlin very soon, the daily flow of refugees into West Berlin tripled, and by July 1961, over 1,000 East Germans were crossing daily into West Berlin. By August of 1961, this daily flow of refugees had risen to almost 2,000. So on the night of August 13, 1961, just 2 months after the failed Vienna summit, the East German government installed a makeshift barbed wire barrier between East and West Berlin. In some areas, though, the wall was simply bricked up windows and doors of apartment buildings that sat directly on the borderline. Between 1962 and 65, these buildings on the borderline were raised to ensure guards had an unobstructed view and a clear field of fire. So a second parallel fence was built approximately 100 meters behind the first, creating a controlled no man's land. But there were still cases of escapees driving vehicles through the fences. So there was a need for a solid structure. So between 1965 and 75, a concrete wall, which comprised concrete slabs supported by steel girders, was built. It introduced anti-grip tubes along the top to make it nearly impossible to gain a handhold, making escape even more difficult. So how did the world react to the barbed wire fences separating East and West Berlin? Well, within approximately a week of the barbed wire fences coming up, the Allies set up Checkpoint Charlie as the official designated point for members of Allied forces, diplomats, and foreign tourists to cross over into East Berlin. But a few months later, in October of 1961, there was a massive escalation at Checkpoint Charlie, which almost triggered World War III. In October of 1961, East German border police broke protocol and attempted to demand identification from US diplomats entering East Berlin. In response, US General Lucius Clay authorized Operation Checkpoint placing US Army M48 tanks directly at the crossing to assert Allied access rights. On October 27, 10 American tanks took positions, and shortly after, 10 Soviet T-55 tanks arrived. The two sets of tanks were facing each other within 50 to 100 meters. For several hours of high tension, engines were left running and weapons were fully loaded. The standoff was finally resolved through back-channel diplomacy between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, leading to both sides gradually withdrawing their tanks. After this incident, Checkpoint Charlie became the primary symbolic hotspot of Cold War tensions. Meanwhile, between 1975 and 1989, the Berlin Wall was virtually fortified to completely prevent any efforts to escape. And a key element of this fortification was the death strip. The death strip, which was about a belt of land 50 yards wide between the inner and the outer border walls. The death strip contained various traps, which included anti-vehicle trenches and steel tank traps to stop vehicles. Trained attack dogs were leashed to long wires to alert guards, and it had signal fences that triggered alarms when touched. But the deadliest and most inhumane of them all was Stalin's carpet. Stalin's carpet were large steel mats embedded with upward-pointing iron spikes, which were roughly 5 to 6 inches long and razor sharp. They were designed to pierce the feet of anyone attempting to run or jump across the border. And these were hidden under a thin layer of sand. The aim was not to prevent, but to trap the escapees. And the death strip was supplemented with 302 watchtowers, and the entire area was brightly lit at night. So what was the actual impact of the wall on the migration numbers between East and West Germany? The wall did have a drastic impact on the migration and escapes from East Germany into West. Prior to the wall, the flow of migrants from East to West averaged about 1,000 per day. After the wall, between 1962 to 1989, it dropped to approximately 58 per day. But if we were to look strictly at the period after the death strip was laid, the daily number was less than 10. The longing for freedom is an amazing trait that leads humans into amazing bouts of creativity and daring. And among all the escapes from East Berlin into West, one story of escape stands out, and it occurred underground. In 1963, a group of West German students laid out an elaborate escape plan by digging a tunnel underneath the Berlin Wall. In 1961, Joachim Neumann, an East German, was able to cross over into the West using the borrowed passport of a Swiss student. But when he did so, he left behind most of his family and friends, including his girlfriend, Krista. So Neumann, along with other escapees, devised a plan to reunite with their families by getting them over to the West using an underground tunnel. But Neumann's first attempt failed miserably because someone informed the East German secret police, Stasi, who arrested most of the escapees in the act, and among them was Krista, who was caught and sentenced to 16 months in prison. Undeterred, Neumann tried again. This time he and his group of fellow students identified an abandoned bakery in West Berlin, which was close to the Berlin Wall on the western side. Neumann, along with a dozen other men, burrowed down 11 meters into the ground from the bakery and dug an opening wide enough for one person to slither through on hands and knees parallel to the ground above. The digging took 5 months and was very grueling work. Newman and his accomplices slept in the bakery for week-long shifts. They piled up sacks of dirt in flour sacks and rinsed off the encrusted mud from their bodies with buckets of water. Basically, they did not want to arouse any suspicion when they left their shifts. After digging 145 meters of tunnel, the group were able to emerge on the eastern side on October 3, 1964. Luckily, they emerged inside an old outhouse behind an apartment building with no border guards in the vicinity. Immediately, they sent out word to all their friends and relatives to come to the outhouse behind the specific apartment building and whisper the code word, Tokyo. Why Tokyo? Because the Tokyo Olympics were just about a week away. As the escapees started slowly trickling in, on the other side of the wall, on a tall building, one person had been stationed to watch the street to make sure it was clear. And if there was a problem, they were supposed to shine a gold light. The first night of the escape went very smoothly, and all the escapees were able to make to the western side safely. The next day, Newman received an unexpected letter from his girlfriend Krista that she had been let out early. Newman immediately sent word to her to get to the outhouse that evening. The second evening of the escape, too, was going smoothly until a few of the border guards on patrol noticed that something was off. A few plainclothes officers were sent who quickly realized what was happening and called for backup. In the ensuing confusion, everyone scrambled their way back into the tunnel to get to the western side, and a few shots were fired between the border guards and the escape accomplices. A young border guard named Egon Schultz was killed. All in all, 57 people escaped to West Berlin via this tunnel, and as a result, this tunnel came to be known as Tunnel 57. In response to the killing of the border guard, Newman and his accomplices released balloons over the wall with a letter attached. The letter said, "The real murderer is the system that addressed the massive flight of its citizens, not by removing the cause of the problem, but by building a wall and giving the order for Germans to shoot Germans." After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it was discovered that the shot that killed Egon Schultz had actually been fired by a fellow border soldier. So what actually led to the ultimate collapse of the Berlin Wall? Though there were a series of events that collectively led to the collapse, the groundwork was laid when the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev stated very clearly to all of Eastern Europe that the Soviets would no longer send tanks and armies to suppress protests. And as his policy of openness unfolded, he was challenged at a pivotal moment by US President Ronald Reagan to bring down the barriers between Eastern and Western Europe. And that pivotal moment happened on June 12, 1987, in a square facing the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin. Ronald Reagan, in presence of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, addressed a crowd of West Berliners and delivered a few lines in his speech that would become an inspiration towards the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Take a listen.
Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Following this speech and further reforms from Mikhail Gorbachev, Hungary in May-June of 1989 became the first Eastern European nation to open its border with Austria, allowing its citizens to travel freely to the West. And after this, several nations across Eastern Europe started pressing for freedom and democracy. And in East Germany, this was triggered via the Monday demonstrations in the city of Leipzig in September of 1989. Through September and October of 1989, people in Leipzig continued to protest despite a heavy police presence. Within a month and a half, East German leader Erich Honecker was forced to resign. On November 4, 1989, a massive demonstration of 500,000 protesters took place in East Berlin. The protesters were demanding democratic reforms and easing of restrictions. In a moment of panic, the local leadership huddled together to discuss easing of restrictions. Within a few days, they decided to ease restrictions and allow East Berliners to travel abroad for private trips. This memo, easing restrictions, was passed over to the spokesperson, Gunther Schabowski, to announce at a press conference. Now, Schabowski did not read this memo before proceeding to the press conference. At 6 p.m. on November 9, 1989, Gunther Schabowski virtually read out the memo to the audience without knowing what was coming. He read, "Private travel outside the country will now be allowed without any prerequisites. Permits will be issued on short notice." There was a massive uproar within the audience, and an Italian journalist stood up and asked Schabowski, "When does this go into effect?" Now, had Schabowski read the memo, he would have known that it stated that it went into effect the following morning at 10 a.m. when the passport office opened. But actually, Schabowski tried to sift through the papers and looked up and said, "Well, as I understand it, it goes into effect immediately." The West German broadcasters immediately picked it up and started reporting on TV and radio that the border was open. This prompted East Berliners to head to the border crossings in massive numbers. By 9 p.m., more than 30,000 people had gathered at the various gates near the border crossings. The border guards were completely overwhelmed. They had no idea what was happening, and they had received no instructions about this. So at 11:30 p.m., unable to control the crowds, the border guards stopped checking IDs and opened the gates, allowing everybody to flood into West Berlin. People from both sides met, danced, and began tearing down sections of the wall with hammers and chisels, confining this artificial barrier to the trash can of history. And while we celebrate the collapse and fall of the Berlin Wall, it is important to remember that it was Mikhail Gorbachev who, by disallowing the use of military force against civilian protesters, prevented another Tiananmen Square from happening in East Germany. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which Shakespearean character was among the earliest kings of Scotland? The answer is A. Macbeth. Question for the current episode. Which border checkpoint in East Berlin witnessed the most crossings on the night of the collapse of the Berlin Wall? Was it A. Checkpoint Charlie, B. Sonnenallee, C. Invalidenstrasse, or D. Bornholmerstrasse? Once again, which border checkpoint in East Berlin witnessed the most crossings on the night of the collapse of the Berlin Wall? Was it A. Checkpoint Charlie, B. Sonnenallee, C. Invalidenstrasse, or D. Bornholmerstrasse? The answer will be provided in the next episode. And that's all we have in today's program. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.